so much. Well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share with my wonderful friends a new course that I have developed specifically in response to the novel coronavirus pandemic that has plunged the whole world into crisis. And we are certainly in a crisis, in this country particularly, because the pandemic has had devastating economic consequences. Millions of our fellow citizens are out of work with an uncertain future, not knowing whether their jobs will come back. As we now know, social tensions have been greatly exacerbated, and African Americans who have suffered from inequality are feeling that poignantly now and responding in outrage. Young people look at an uncertain future. And so we are definitely in the midst of a crisis. As you probably know, a curfew was declared right here in Dayton last night from 9 o'clock until 6 o'clock this morning. Now, our work together over the next weeks will be to explore the early Christian response to epidemics. In the year 165 AD, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. And Pastor Charlie, I think you have a picture of Marcus Aurelius. Yes, there he is. That's a good bust of him. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a devastating epidemic swept over the Roman Empire. Historians today believe that it was smallpox, and it devastated the previously unexposed population of the Mediterranean. The pandemic lasted for 15 years, and 1/4 of the population of the Roman Empire died, including Marcus Aurelius himself, who succumbed to the pandemic in Vienna in the year 180. Now, Pastor Charlie, if you'll take, we will move on. In the year 200 and equally devastating epidemic broke out, and this time the rural areas were deeply affected. Historians believe that it was measles. Reduce
Larry, we're having some trouble with your audio.
Is my audio not coming through, Charlie? Can you hear me?
I can. It's breaking up a little bit.
Yeah.
If you try to,
well, let's try.
If everybody mutes their video, it might help the bandwidth problem.
Yes, that's been my experience too. So Hello? Good morning, John.
Muted. Hello.
Okay, Larry, let's
So
try.
if you can mute.
Yep. I've
All
muted.
right. Can you hear me now, Pastor Charlie?
Yes.
Good. So in 251 AD, a second equally devastating pandemic were hit. Historians believe that it was measles. The role that these pandemics played has not always been recognized by historians. In fact, a few days ago, I climbed up to the 3rd floor of my house where I have all my books and papers and reference works by great church historians. And would you believe that in every book prior to 1997, I could not find in the indices even an entry under epidemic. And I think that the resettlement of barbarians, our ancestors, Germans, Britons, the resettlement of these people as landholders that is a rational attempt to deal with created and slow to recognize the importance of disease in the history of the Roman Empire. It's surprising because who we will talk about later, Dionysius of Alexandria, they all talk about the important role of disease in the development of early Christianity. Now, this situation, this general disregard of the importance of epidemics was partially remedied in the year 1997 by the publication named Rodney Stark. And his book is called The Rise of Christianity. And in that book, he devotes an entire chapter to the role of pandemics in the history of the early church. Let me talk about both of those pandemics for a few minutes. In 165 is sometimes referred to as the plague of Galen. The doctor, Galen, was alive during that pandemic, and he describes the devastating effect of it on the population of the city of Rome, where Galen was giving popular lectures at the time. And Pastor Charlie is now a picture of Galen back up on the screen. What Galen reports is that the epidemic began in the east, in Persia, where the Roman army under Lucius was fighting against the Parthians. The Roman soldiers, and when they returned to disease like wildfire, speaks of caravans, carts and wagons hauling. So many people died in the cities and villages of Italy and the provinces that many cities abandoned. In fact, the campaign of the Roman army against the Marcomanni, a Germanic tribe in northern Germany, the pandemic spread to the Marcomanni. And when the Roman soldiers lined up on the battlefield, they first. Now, Pastor Charlie, we can exact mortality. Historians, of course, work on the basis of analogies. And when disease epidemics exposed populations, the mortality rate is extremely high. For example,
Larry, we're having a very hard time hearing you right now.
Yes, I was worried about that. I reset, as you know, I reset the router, and I don't know what else to do about it.
Can you,
Do you have a suggestion?
can you try and reset it one more time and see what happens? We can wait a couple minutes and see if that allows that to happen.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll do that. Now, on my screen, I'm showing that I have a full signal strength. Well, not quite. Am I coming through?
You're coming
No?
through, but it's very choppy is what's happening. And so we're having issues
All right.
with that. So
I'm wondering if Larry might try to connect by telephone instead of using, it might be his computer microphone.
that could be. So that's a possibility too, is that if you want to also connect to us through audio and use the Zoom login, we can also have you, we can see you, but then we can also hear you through the phone line and make
All
that.
right. What's the phone number I should call?
So I would have to find that.
Go back to the link.
Let me,
Should I go back to the link?
yes.
Let's see here.
There's an option to connect.
I don't see a telephone number on the link.
Let me
You
grab that. real
Hit the link. Hit the link again.
quick. We're learning this together, folks.
Click on that. Okay. I think you have to go back to the.
I did that.
Okay. Oh,
There's the link.
and then when you click on it, you usually have the option to connect by phone.
I don't see a phone number.
No, you don't. It's here
I've done that.
now. You go back and get lower him.
Okay, we're repeating the same process.
I'm sorry.
Let's see.
Any suggestions?
Yeah, let me see if I can find it on my end because I've got to find the.
While you're looking for that, I suppose I'll just try resetting the router.
Well, now you're coming through loud and clear.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, you want me to continue then?
Continue on, and if we get into a spot, I found the information. So go ahead and see what we've got here.
All right. Do you think people can hear me now?
Yes.
Good.
Yep. Go ahead. And now you know what I'm going to do, Larry, is I'm going to stay off of the sharing the pictures. I wonder if that's causing issues too. So sharing the screen.
All right. Thank you. Yes. So I've been talking so far about the two pandemics that struck in the ancient world, smallpox and measles, but the focus
That's causing issues again, Larry.
having issues
Yeah.
again. How about now?
No. I've got
No.
so can you have a pencil and paper, Larry? I'm sorry about this.
Yes, go right ahead.
So the phone number is 1-312-626-6779. Oh, 799. I'm sorry.
6799.
Yes.
All right, I'll try calling in.
Then the meeting number is, I got to give you a couple more numbers here.
Yeah,
Meeting number is 819
819
7793
7793
3117.
3117.
And if it asks for a password,
Yes,
it's 684
684
022.
022.
Give that a try and we'll see what we can do.
All right.
Hey, Larry, you should probably exit the meeting before you do that. Otherwise, you're going to have a really loud echo that is just going to blow everybody
All right,
away.
that's what I'll do.
Okay.
I'll try exiting the meeting.
Or I can just mute you here, Larry. Let me just mute you here. So that way I can keep visual on you.
Okay.
Okay. It's time for a coffee break, everyone. So enjoy.
Henry just loves saying hi to people. You want to say hi? Yeah. Okay, thank you. They can't hear you. Talk now.
So, Lily's and her pets.
You're just having a great time, huh?
There we go.
Oops.
Hello, Larry.
Sorry.
Well,
Sorry again.
just a second. Just a second. I need to
Again.
unmute. Okay.
So, Pastor Charlie, am I coming through?
Yes, you are.
Now, I suppose I need. How can I avoid the echo?
You got to exit the meeting from your computer.
we're gonna hear your voice but not see your face is what's gonna happen. So, okay.
You don't have to hold it up.
So can you hear me now? No, it's still.
Okay, try
It's
another.
still. All right, now, do you have the audio?
I have the audio, but we're not going to be able to see your beautiful face. I'm sorry about that.
Well, you're not missing anything. All right, shall I continue?
Yes,
That's perfect.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll try to work this out in a better way next week. And I certainly apologize if the problem is being caused from my end. The point of our course is actually not a study of epidemiology, but rather, how do people of faith respond to the crisis? You see, I am proposing that it makes a difference what people believe. And religion, faith, provides explanation. We know that here in Ohio. If any of you have been to see the reenactment of Tecumseh and how the Indians of the Ohio Valley responded to the spread of drunkenness, disease, and despair, they were revitalized by religious movements within the 19th century Indian society. So I'd like to ask you for a minute to imagine yourself a pagan in one of the cities of the Mediterranean in 165 when the epidemic broke out. The city where you live is stinking of death. All around us, family and friends are dropping. And of course, human beings are driven to ask, why? Why is this happening? Why them and not me? Will we all die? What can we do? Why does the world exist anyway? Now, if you are a pagan, you have options in terms of finding a rationale or an explanation. I should, of course, point out that people in the ancient world knew nothing about viruses. In fact, they didn't even know about bacteria. So as the disease spreads, you can go to the doctor or to the priest or to the philosopher. The doctor, of course, does not have an explanation because the existence of viruses were unknown. And what I have to now tell you is that the great Dr. Galen, who had such a large following in the city of Rome, when the epidemic broke out, Galen was offered a place of retreat in the hinterland of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, and he accepted the offer. Galen fled. That's easy to understand, isn't it? Since he didn't know how to cure the disease, he took refuge. The pagan priest, in many cases, fled the cities along with the other wealthy people. The philosophers pointed to natural law or chance. And while the plague raged, the philosophers talked about the decline of virtue in a world that was growing old. Because of Galen's flight, his account of the pandemic in Rome breaks off when he left the city. And so, for a pagan perspective, we have to turn to the historian Thucydides. You may recall that during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the plague broke out in Athens while the city was under siege. And Thucydides describes what happened. Here is his account. Quote, "The doctors were entirely incapable of treating the disease because of their ignorance of the right methods. Equally useless were prayers made in the temples, consultation of the oracles, and so forth. Indeed, in the end, people were so overcome by their suffering that they paid no further attention to religious things." And now I apologize for the next paragraph that I'm going to read because it is gruesome. So here's my warning. Because of the contagion, Thucydides says, people were afraid to visit one another. As a result, they died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished through lack of attention. The bodies of the dying were heaped one on top of the other, and half-dead creatures could be seen staggering about in the streets or flocking around the fountains in their desire for water. The temples were full of dead bodies of those who had gone to the temple in search of refuge. For the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men and women, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of law or religion. I guess we owe something to Thucydides. He is the most detailed, the most highly admired historian in the ancient world, and he doesn't spare his readers a graphic account of what happened, that people abandoned those that were sick. Now, by contrast, when we turn to the early Christians, faith seems to have provided some answers. And now with your indulgence, I'm going to read 2 letters that were written by Christian bishops in the outbreak of the measles epidemic in 251. Cyprian of Carthage. What a great early Christian, what a wonderful writer. I've often felt that if I had not written my dissertation on the Apostle Paul, I probably would have worked on Cyprian. Cyprian wrote a pastoral letter. I'm going to provide you with bibliography that will allow you to read the entire letter. But because our time today is short, I'm just going to read the most relevant portions. Here we go. And I'm going to stop along the way and highlight certain things. Quote, "The just are dying along with the unjust. Now, that is such a crucial recognition. I'm sure you all can remember when the AIDS epidemic was spreading, that some religious people believed that people were suffering the punishment that they deserved because of their sexuality or their lifestyle. But Cyprian recognizes clearly that the epidemic made no distinction between the just and the unjust. Now, look how he continues. It is not for you to think that the destruction is a common one for both the evil and the good. So now he begins to analyze the consequences and to unpack the response. He continues, the just are called to refreshment. The unjust are carried off to punishment. And then he observes how suitable it is that this plague and pestilence, which seems so horrible and deadly, searches out the justice of each and every one of us and examines the minds of the human race. And now he gives examples of the examination. Listen to this. Whether the well will care for their kinspeople as they should, whether masters will show compassion for their ailing slaves, whether physicians will or will not desert the afflicted. You see how he places the emphasis upon the response. And then he continues, although this mortality has contributed nothing else, it has especially accomplished this for Christians and servants of God, namely, that we are encountering a fate equal to martyrdom, while we are learning not to be afraid of death. And then he interprets the disease. He says, these are trying exercises for us, not deaths. They give to the mind the glory of fortitude, and by contempt for death, they prepare us for the crown. Our brothers and sisters who have been freed from the world by the summons of death should not be mourned, since we know that they are not lost, but sent on ahead of us, that in departing they lead the way, that as travelers, as voyagers are accustomed to be, they should be longed for, but not lamented, and that no occasion should be given to the pagans to censure us on the grounds that we grieve for those who we say are living. Well, I think you can probably see why I love Cyprian and find his work so inspiring. His faith makes a great difference. How do we respond to an epidemic that we cannot control? Do we remain with our sick loved ones? And what beliefs lead us to make a different response? The second letter that I want to read, again, a short passage, is by Dionysius of Alexandria. He was the bishop in Alexandria in 251 when the measles epidemic broke out. And here is what he wrote to the people in his flock. Quote, "Most of our fellow Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, not sparing themselves, but instead thinking of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick. They nursed them, attending to their needs and ministering to them. And often with them, the nurses departed this life, for they were infected by others with the disease. They drew upon themselves the sickness of their neighbors, and they cheerfully accepted others' pains as their own." Now listen to this. Dionysius says, "Many in nursing and caring for others transferred their death to themselves, so that while those who were nursed recovered, the nurses died in their stead." And now listen to what he says next, a very honest confession. "The best of our brothers and sisters lost their lives in this manner. A number of our presbyters, deacons, and lay people, winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way to be the equal of martyrdom." And then Dionysius reflects upon the behavior of his pagan neighbors. He describes how they responded. Quote, "The heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled even from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead. And they treated unburied corpses like dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they might, they found it difficult to escape." Now, of course, I should acknowledge that these are the letters of two Christian bishops. They are not the objective, dispassionate accounts of historians. They are writing to encourage their flock to nurse one another, to care for one another. And I'm sure that not every Christian lived up to the standard of behavior that Cyprian and Dionysius are praising. But there is a difference in how people responded based upon what they believed. Everyone was afraid, that's clear. Galen, the great doctor, his flight to Turkey is so understandable. It is so normal. that's what anyone would do unless you happen to be one of those Christians. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that Christian faith taught that death was not the end, that God had not abandoned persons who were sick and dying. And now I want to point out the consequences, the difference that it made. The Christians didn't have any drugs. They didn't have any sort of vaccines. They engaged in simple, ordinary nursing, providing water, blankets, food. And the result was a differential mortality rate. That's the conclusion drawn by the sociologist Rodney Stark. Stark notices that following the two pandemics of the 2nd and the 3rd century, the Christian proportion of the population of the Roman Empire increased dramatically. Well, I'm going to pause at this point and ask for your questions, comments, observations, and after we've had a chance to talk a little bit, I will then outline the trajectory of our course in coming weeks, because we're going to go together in search of the faith that made all the difference. Where did it come from? How did the Christians come to believe something different and to respond to the epidemics in a different way? So, Pastor Charlie, is it possible now to unmute everyone?
Yes, I'm going to do that carefully. And what may be best is I have a visual of the people here, and if they want to speak, I could ask them to simply wave to me and I can call on them to be able to do that. So
that's great.
That might be the best way for me to control the class, so to speak. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Dr. Wellborn? Yes, John.
Larry, this isn't exactly related, but I noticed the two bishops that you used are both appeared to be people, African people, not African Americans. But is there any indication of the proportion of people in the ancient times who were non-Caucasian who were Christians? Was it a majority?
Thank you so much, John, for that good question. What Cyprian and Dionysius of Alexandria have in common, of course, is that they are both North Africans. Cyprian is the bishop in Carthage. Dionysius is the bishop in Alexandria. We actually have icons, which I passed on to Pastor Charlie. I don't think you've had a chance to look at them because of the technological problems that we've had.
Well,
but
Larry, let me jump in there. I was able to put those pictures up while we were doing that. So
good. Thank you.
Yep.
Oh, thank you. So then you can see that Cyprian clearly is a person of darker complexion. Now, what I want to point out is that race was not as important in the ancient world as it is today. Today, race has become a real dividing line between people because of the long, sad history of slavery and Jim Crow. In the ancient world, culture and class, social class, were more important as discriminators among people. So the poor classes in the Roman Empire felt the impact of these pandemics much more than the wealthy. The wealthy were able to flee. They had estates in the countryside outside of the cities, and like Galen, they were able to escape. Now, there's an ironic point here. The first epidemic, the smallpox pandemic in 165, Galen, before he fled from the city of Rome, he points out that in the initial stages, the pandemic spread more quickly among the upper class. Why? Because they had the custom of kissing one another on the cheek, as Europeans still have today. When I go with Diane to these international ombudsman meetings, everyone I meet wants to kiss me on the cheek, and they expect that I will do that too. And so the smallpox epidemic initially spread more quickly among the upper class because they kissed one another. But as the epidemic ravaged the population, people who had money retreated from the city. They moved out to their country estates. John, that was a very good question. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Larry Hofsis. Let me unmute. You need to unmute yourself, Larry. There you go.
Larry, mindful of the fact that today is the Festival of Pentecost, and we'll have that Acts 2 reading in which persons from nations all over the Mediterranean world, including probably North Africa, it bears possibly further credulity to your claim that the dividing lines between nations were much more cultural than they were race-wise. Would that be true?
Yes, that is exactly right. As it turns out, by the 1st century of the Common Era, the Mediterranean was very mobile. The Mediterranean Sea, of course, was largely cleared of pirates by Pompeius Magnus in the 1st century BC, and the Roman road system. The Romans built roads all over the Mediterranean. You can still see them today. And so a person, let me give an example, a person like Lucian of Samosata, who was born in Syria, spent most of his life in Rome and even traveled to Britain. Mm-hmm. So the ancient world was very mobile, and nationality or skin color did not prevent a person. There were actually, by the 3rd century, there was a Roman emperor who was very dark complected, but he had been born into a wealthy family, and he had been educated in Roman culture, Roman history. So the dividing lines were social and cultural, but that had an impact on the population. The people who lived in Alexandria and who lived in Rome, before Galen fled from Rome, listen to this, he records that 5,000 people a day, 5,000 a day, were dying in the city of Rome. And most of those were people who lived in poor neighborhoods like Trastevere, where the Vatican is today, or in ghettos like the area out beyond the Porta Capena. If you were wealthy, you could withdraw to your country estate. Other questions, comments?
Hi, this is Cecilia. Hi. And I'm from,
Good.
good morning, everybody. I'm from Fairview Church, and we received the information about Larry's class, so I'm joining in today. So thank you very much. Okay.
We're glad to have you with us.
Yeah. One thing, Larry, one thing that you mentioned, you thought that some of the descriptions were a little more than we could handle. I think we're hearing so much more now about the deaths and the inability to bury people that what you read just seemed almost ordinary. And so it almost scares me to think that indeed, when we start hearing of the devastation and indeed the way the pandemics hit, and so many bodies and so many people dying that can't be buried in a proper way, that what we're seeing now is similarly happening all over the world and even in this country. And so it does not feel as though it's changed too much, which is scary. And
thank you so much. Thank you so much for that good observation. Can I just respond to that? The neighborhood in New York, where Diane and I have our little apartment, where I stay when I'm teaching at Fordham, that little apartment is in the Bronx, and the neighborhood where we have our apartment has the highest mortality per capita mortality rate in the United States. My colleagues at Fordham have reported to me that until just very recently, the sound of sirens, the wail of ambulances and EMTs was almost constant, day and night, as a background noise. And you've seen the pictures, I'm sure, on cable news of bodies piled up in New York City and in Italy. It's just heartbreaking. And we don't know where any of this is going. We don't have a vaccine. We don't know, despite the best efforts of scientists, we don't know that there will be one or when it will come. And because of the underlying social and racial inequalities in our country, now all over the United States, thousands of people are out on the street protesting, and protesting in large groups. And of course, the danger is that the coronavirus will spread even more rapidly because of groups of people assembling. My wife's grandmother explained to us that when the so-called Spanish flu devastated the whole world in 1917, 1918, it spread so quickly precisely because of the war, because of the First World War. Soldiers who were being transported back and forth across the Atlantic brought the disease with them. And so when they came into the port in New York City, it had a devastating impact. So I think your observation is exactly right. And the accuracy of your insight brings us back to the question, how do we respond? What sort of resource does faith provide? Confronted with this crisis, many of the social problems all around our world have been exposed. The mask has been ripped off of many of our social tensions. And moving forward, we will have choices to make on what are our values. And as we're going to discover together next week and the week after that and so forth, the early Christians had reasons for the fact that they did not abandon the sick, but instead risked their own lives to nurse them. And of course, as you know, in the process, some people acquired immunity. So that kind of vulnerability, that kind of fidelity, that sort of ethical consistency with the underlying beliefs, that's what I will be inviting our class to think deeply about in coming weeks. Are there other questions, comments?
Yes, Sharon, you can unmute yourself. There you go.
So I was listening to you earlier when you were talking about, somebody got sick. There were 3 people that they could turn to: the doctor, the priest, or the philosopher.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit more about what the philosopher's role might have been if somebody turned to them for guidance?
Yes, thank you very much. The philosophers, of course, believed that ultimately it was a matter of vice. They had no explanation for the spread of the disease, and so they recommended morality, virtue. But one thing that is important for us to know, and we will talk about this at much greater length in a couple of weeks, philosophers were expected to perform the services of psychologists in the ancient world. Let me give an example. There is a pseudo-Platonic dialogue called the Axiochus. It's a little short dialogue. It was probably written in the 1st century AD, and it describes a man named Axiochus whose son became very sick and died. Axiochus himself was sick, but he recovered. His grief over the death of his son and his fear over his own close encounter with death led Axiochus to lock himself up in his house. He wouldn't respond to friends. He wouldn't come out. And so, instead of going to get a doctor, the friends of Axiochus, can you guess? They went and got Socrates. And they said, Socrates, please come quickly. You need to administer the drugs of consolation. The consoling arguments. And so Socrates comes to the house of Axiochus and he reasons with him. He says, first he generalizes the misfortune. He says, Axiochus, don't imagine that you are the only one whose son has died from a disease. No, this is a fate, Socrates says, that is common to humanity. And then Socrates argues that disease can only affect our bodies, but the better part of us, the soul, is not touched or need not be touched by the disease if you can persuade yourself that the soul is immortal and goes on to the Elysian fields or returns to the stars after death. So what the philosophers had to offer basically were consolations, consoling arguments. That was about it. They didn't have, as we will soon see, they didn't have what the Christians had. They didn't have faith, and we're going to discover what a huge difference that makes. That was a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that question. It gave me a chance to tell you about the Axiochus.
Thank you. It was a good answer.
Pastor Charlie, do we have time for one more question?
Sure. Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to offer a question or a comment. I'm not seeing any responses.
Well, then let me tell you where we're going next week. This course moves backwards. We've started with the fact that in the 2nd and the 3rd century, the early Christians responded differently than their pagan neighbors. Now we are going in search of the reason why. And so if you would like to read ahead for next week, we're going to look at 2 passages in particular. First, the Epistle of James, chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, and then 2 Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. We're going to begin our class next week by taking a tour of the most famous healing shrine in the ancient world, the Temple of Asclepius at Epidemics. And I'll have pictures to show next week. Some of you may have been there. And we're going to situate these 2 New Testament texts alongside what we learn by walking around the Temple of Asclepius, reading the inscriptions, and looking at the statues. And I think you'll begin to see what a difference faith makes.
Cool.
I should warn you that the first of our 2 texts from the New Testament, the Epistle of James, has been misused and abused, I think, by some interpreters. And we're going to spend some time clarifying that. And I'm going to offer a different interpretation of that passage from James, different from the one that is offered by TV preachers. And then let me tell you ahead of time that I believe there is a breakthrough moment in 2 Corinthians where Paul breaks through the seafloor of his own being to a deeper insight into the meaning of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the implications that that has for disease and for sickness and suffering.
Larry, do you want to share those verses again, please?
Yes, thank you. James chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, and 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 9. Pastor Charlie, I'm very grateful for everyone who participated today. Very grateful to you for helping us work through our technological problems. Grateful to Bill Sayre for suggesting a solution.
And Larry, what we'll do is we will talk in the coming days. I think we have some solutions we're looking at. So to make sure that you might be able to be hardwired, maybe even coming in here to providing the class from here and having that set up. So we'll work on those details and make sure that we got that squared away. So
thank you.
So thank you, everyone. Worship starts in 24 minutes. So hope to see you there.
Thank you, Larry. So much.
Bye all.
Thanks to everybody. Such a good
Thank you.
question.
Blessings to you all.